Good evening, and thank you for joining us for a one-hour WTTW news special, Peace and Justice. I'm Brandis Friedman. Chicago and the nation have been going through a painful time. The death of George Floyd in Minnesota has once again brought the issue of police-community relations, and particularly interactions with communities of color, back to the forefront of the national discussion. Tonight, we'll spend the hour looking at the history of the issue here in Chicago and how some are dealing with it and what strategies might help get to the root of the problems. You can join the conversation on Twitter using the hashtag #PeaceAndJusticeWTTW. Then tonight at 8 p.m., right after this program, head to WTTW.com/peaceandjustice to join us for an online community discussion. Chicago is an important city in the history of segregation, race relations, and civil rights. In 1966, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. came to Chicago to protest against discriminatory housing practices. He settled in the West Side neighborhood of North Lawndale. The neighborhood suffered from the riots and looting in 1968 after Dr. King's death, and in many ways has spent the last 50-plus years recovering. So how is it coping with the events of these last few weeks? Paris Schutz spent the day reporting in North Lawndale and joins us now near the old Sears and Roebuck Tower. Hi, Paris.
Hey, Brandis. Yeah, to sum it up, mixed reactions. On one sense, some fear that the looting and the devastation early last week could turn back decades of progress that this community had made since 1968. But on the other sense, hope that the aftermath could galvanize North Lawndale like nothing else has. As you look behind me at one of the landmarks here in the neighborhood, the original Sears Tower in Chicago, Sears Roebuck and Company, now known as the Nichols Tower. It is a landmark that survives this community after so much was destroyed in 1968. And you mentioned King's residency here. He lived at this corner, Hamlin and 16th, in North Lawndale, which is now a new complex known as the MLK Legacy Apartments. And then on the ground floor sits a small museum devoted to his time here and his fight against discriminatory housing practices. And following his assassination in Memphis in 1968, North Lawndale and much of the west side of Chicago went up in flames. It left abandoned apartment buildings, empty lots, and led to disinvestment that the community has been fighting for the better part of the last 50-plus years. A few longtime residents told me that the looting and uprising last week reminded them of that tumultuous year, 1968, and they had mixed reactions to it.
It's worse.
It's worse.
It's worse.
How come?
It was worse because there's no end to it. And, you know, as you look at it, what they done, we never recovered.
This time around, there wasn't as much to burn. So, you know, the fires of the late 60s, we've been slow to replace, you know, bringing new development back to the community.
And you can see the aftermath of last week's looting and violence on Ogden and Roosevelt Road, some of the main commercial strips here. As most businesses are boarded up and closed, there is a local grocery store that is partially open. But this devastation adds pain for a community that has struggled to attract business in good times. It's been racked with unemployment now since the COVID shutdown. And it's a neighborhood whose essential businesses were almost all targeted early last week.
In 67, 68, when we had the riots, Roosevelt was torn up, Ogden was torn up, 16th Street was torn up, and we've never really recovered from that. You know, when I saw people looting and tearing up places that they need to shop and get their services from, you know, it just made me think about our community and burning down. Fortunately, we were not as bad as 68, 67, 68, by no means. However, our commercial strips were damaged really, really bad.
Now, there's one longtime business, the Del Car Pharmacy on 16th Avenue. It was largely untouched, and owner Edwin Muldrow, he took over this business from his father, who opened it in 1960, so it survived that 68 unrest. Now, Muldrow told me he believes it was community members looking out for his store that made the difference, not police. In fact, he says he rarely ever turns to police when something goes wrong in the neighborhood.
If there is some criminal activity going on, I don't call the police. I find out who's calling shots. And then once I do that, then I deal with them directly. And I've learned, and through my father, that you get more respect that way, because the community is saying, okay, we appreciate that you're not calling the police. You're willing to deal with us one-on-one. So I don't have any problems. So if there is a problem, I know who to talk to, and then they take care of that.
Really highlights the divide between the police and community members in some of these neighborhoods. And despite the devastation, hundreds upon hundreds of volunteers came out early last week to clean up the Lawndale Plaza shopping mall, as well as other parts of the neighborhood. Local pastor James Brooks, who is a senior staff member for the Lawndale Christian Health Center, says it was racism that caused the rioting last week, but it is the resilience of the community that will move it beyond this.
Even though the looting took place, that was unfortunate, but we saw a great response on that Monday following. I mean, hundreds of residents came out just to help clean up the debris. It was amazing, and we were laughing and smiling while doing it. Young people, it was just a great gift to see the community come together. I believe like never before in times like this.
And resiliency is a word we heard all over North Lawndale today. And in a bit, we'll be back with a local community activist and his recollections of 1968 and beyond. And now, Brandis, we toss it back to you.
Yeah, that's right, Paris. There was actually another cleanup effort in North Lawndale over the weekend. A lot of resiliency there. Thank you. Chicago has a long, complex, and deeply painful history of race relations and the relationship between the city's residents of color and the police and political leaders who are supposed to serve them. A look at that history can create the disorienting sense of reading the same sentence over and over again.
Get off his back!
For many Chicagoans, George Floyd's killing by a police officer, captured on camera, was a sadly familiar sight.
A Cook County judge ruled today that the city must release the video purported to show a police officer shooting a 17-year-old African-American named Laquan McDonald.
As George Floyd's death on camera echoed that of Laquan McDonald's, so McDonald's death echoed that of another 17-year-old a century earlier.
The 1919 race riots were a mass wave of violence sparked by the death of a teenage boy named Eugene Williams.
Williams was stoned after swimming too close to a whites-only beach. He drowned. In the week of riots that followed, 38 people died. Chicago police were denounced for failing to protect African Americans and to arrest white rioters. The city's treatment of its Black and Latinx residents was a persistent stain in the decades that followed, even if city leaders maintained plausible deniability.
In the South, in Mississippi, racism was obvious. It was the water fountain. Chicago, racism was sometimes hard to see here.
In 1965, Dr. Martin Luther King moved to Chicago to highlight housing conditions for black residents. He took a rock to the head during a march. In 1968, Black Panthers Mark Clark and Fred Hampton took bullets. 99 of them fired into an apartment by law enforcement.
They were really fighting for the poor people and speaking out against the ugly ills of this society.
One of Chicago's ugliest ills? The reign of terror of former police commander John Burge, accused of torturing suspects for decades.
He's gonna put the plastic bag over my head and told me not to bite through it. He said, "Nigga, if you bite through this bag, you're gonna beat me down." He did me like that about 6, 7 times. About the last 4 times, I thought I was dead.
Burge was fired by the department in 1993, but wasn't convicted of a crime until 2010.
Even me, I'm proud to be American for probably one of the very first times in history. I'm proud to be American. I feel a part of this system. I feel a part of the justice right now.
But many others in Chicago don't. Despite many rounds of reforms, community policing programs, and efforts to build bridges between cops and communities, the names of the men and women killed by Chicago police still ring through the city's streets.
Fallout today from Monday's acquittal of a Chicago police officer charged with manslaughter for the killing of Rakia Boyd.
The police shooting of a 37-year-old Southside man, Harith Augustus, is drawing a third night of protest this evening.
55-year-old grandmother Betty Jones and 19-year-old Quintonio LeGrier were both shot and killed by police.
And many Chicagoans are angry not just at officers, but also at a legal system that they think often doesn't hold cops accountable.
State's Attorney Anita Alvarez admitted that the impending release of the video forced her to charge the officer sooner than she would have, despite a year-long investigation.
The officer who killed Laquan McDonald, Jason Van Dyke, did eventually answer for the young life he took.
We, the jury, find the defendant, Jason Van Dyke, guilty of second-degree murder.
Everything we've been through was perfect.
Second-degree murder, y'all.
While Van Dyke's conviction was a victory for activists, it was also a reminder of work left unfinished.
All elected, all civilian, Police Accountability Council. That means we get to say who polices our communities and how our communities are policed. Until we get that power, these injustices will continue to go on and creep back up.
And some black Chicagoans continue to say that their only interactions with police are negative and that has a lasting impact on their communities. For more on that and what activists would like to see done are Mark Clements, a learning fellow with the Chicago Torture Justice Center and a survivor of police torture, Aislinn Pulley, co-founder of Black Lives Matter Chicago, and Damon Williams, a member of the Let Us Breathe collective, which works to imagine a world without police or prisons. Welcome all of you to Chicago tonight, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Aislinn, let's start with you, please. You know, in your experience, what happens when there is a call for police and they show up in the black community?
Typically what happens is police will arrive armed, as they are. You know, the encounter is antagonistic from the beginning because of the nature of the role of policing. And so what we've seen in Chicago is that, you know, a number of folks have been killed by police when in a number of types of crisis. So in psychiatric emergencies, there was Marcus Granson, who was killed a year ago when he was having a psychiatric episode. His father attempted to explain to police, you know, what was happening, and they did not heed his calls for restraint, and ended up shooting and killing him. We know that statistically, up to of people killed by police are in psychiatric distress. So unfortunately, that's not an abnormality. That's unfortunately more the norm rather than not. And so, you know, what we've seen is that when people are in episodes of crises and really needing care, that they are provided with a person that basically acts as a soldier. And so instead of bringing the resources that are actually needed to attempt to resolve or begin to find resolution for the crises, people are met with an armed person. And so that person is...
Right, and sorry, I want to get Damon Williams in on here. So Damon, you had an encounter with police. You shared this on Instagram, your experience at a protest in Hyde Park. This was Sunday, June 1st, where you were injured. And in that same demonstration, it's where the Chicago Police Board President Guion Foreman was struck multiple times by police officers. Were you expecting the police department to respond with that much force?
You can never be surprised by it because it is only thing the police department is authorized to do. But yes, in that moment, it was a surprise. They escalated very quickly, and obviously I would feel unnecessarily. So both and, you know, I always expect abuse from an abusive institution, but I did not expect myself, my own body to be taking that harm on that given day during that time.
Okay, and I want to come back to your thoughts on the police department in a moment as well. Mark Clements, I want to get you in here. When you were 16, you were tortured by police and ultimately convicted of murder in an arson case that you had nothing to do with until you were released in 2009. Now, your uncle was a police officer, your judge was African American as well. So what do you say to the idea that, you know, some of these problems can be solved by having more people of color in leadership in the criminal justice and the legal system?
Well, we have clearly seen that our criminal justice system have acted without regard of human life. I don't think that having a particular race within the police department or among judges would really make any difference. We have seen time and time again, just this last week, just how violent police can be to the Black and brown community. And we have seen throughout the history of just how, I would say, punitive our criminal justice system is, and especially to young people that are tried with serious crimes.
Aislinn, you grew up in Chicago, you went to school here, and of course you helped to start Black Lives Matter locally. You know, what kind of long-term effects does the kind of policing in Black communities that you all are describing, what kind of long-term effects does that have on the community and the people in it?
I think there are enormous long-term effects. I think we're just beginning to, at least, you know, with the Chicago Torture Justice Center, beginning to really understand the full breadth of the consequences of the enormity of brutality, and the effects that it has on us as individuals, as family members, and as community members. We know that survivors, for example, even though it's been decades, you know, past the point of torture, still have nightmares, right? And so a lot of the responses to PTSD and complex trauma that we've seen in other types of survivors, like Holocaust survivors, sexual assault survivors, rape survivors, are very similar in that it's not just the point of the trauma in which that point needs to be addressed, but it's also the compounding effect of the system and the years that it takes in order to really do the psychological work of trying to heal and identify what the harmful consequences are. So I think at this point, we're really starting to learn. There hasn't been apparatus and opportunity to really grapple with the consequences of state violence of this magnitude. And so we're just at the precipice of beginning to understand what the full scope is. We know that it's psychological, we know obviously it's also physical, and we know that it's communal. So at this point, those are the things that we statistically know are true, and we're still learning.
Damon Williams, one of the things we've been hearing a lot about in recent days is defunding the police department, but you actually favor abolishing it altogether. Why is that, and how would that work?
Because I believe, carceral militarism or policing at its absolute best is harmful, and that the collection of harm that we experience from being arrested, being sent to a courtroom, and then being sent to prisons and jails actually outweighs the violence that the police is responding to in its collection. And so we should be defunding the police as a step towards abolition. But I believe that militarism at large, we also need to be talking about our military on a global level, is a harm against our planet and a harm against us as a species, and is actually causing crisis, right? So as we see folks uprising, that is not coming from nowhere. The fact that people have this organic discontent and hatred in their spirit is from generations of abuse. So I would compare our societal state similar to like our environment. And so the same way that we know fossil fuels are destroying our atmosphere and there are all these plans to go green over the next 10, 20, 30 years, guns and cages and fines and torture and detention and deportation are destroying communities and destroying families. And if we continue this, the results will be catastrophic. So in the same way that the city has Go Green by 2050, we need to be figuring out over a generation, how do we eradicate this violent system that derives directly from slavery and warfare and has genocidal impacts.
That said, a lot of police officers, they put on the uniform and the badge because they believe that they are serving their community and protecting their community. How would it work? Crime is not going to stop without a police department. How would it work without a police force?
So one, I think the fact that we have one militarized agent as a catch-all for all violence is problematic. So there are people who know how to deal with sexual violence. There are people who know how to deal with domestic assault. There are people who know how to deal with addiction. There are people who are trained and know how to deal with mental health episodes. We have street and gang and street organization interventions, right? And so bringing in the state as an authority, as a parent to come with a belt, I think on a collective level is an abuse. And so, we can have first responders. So we need a new emergency response system. The answer is not to do nothing, but I would bet that every dollar used doing anything else would be more effective than sending a militarized agent. So if police officers want to be heroic, because I know they've been educated to think that that's what many are sincere in their efforts, and it's not actually about the individual police officer or about the cops, it's about policing and militarism at large. And so if they want to serve their community, be part of the transition. And if you want to respond to gunshot wounds, there are people that know how to train folks, and we can show up with tourniquets without needing a gun. If people need food and housing, there are ways to do these things. We can drive around and have patrol.
Lots of different alternatives, obviously, it sounds like you're advocating for. Mark Clements, we're almost out of time, but what is it that you want people to know about people who are getting out of prison, whether they were victims of police torture? What is it that people need to know that they don't understand?
Well, I think that what we must understand is that in this society, we have one of the biggest mental health problems. The African American community have no mental health facilities, jobs. Want me to tell you, come on, if people are released out of jail and they don't have the opportunity to get a job, what do you think is going to become of those people? So I would say mental health and certainly jobs and housing for people that are being released out of our prison system.
Lots of different support services there that they may be in need of. My thanks to Mark Clements, Aislinn Pulley, and Damon Williams. Thanks to all of you. And now we check back in with Paris Schutz, who is in Chicago's North Lawndale neighborhood on the city's west side. Hey, Paris.
Hey, Brandis, and we're joined now by Richard Townsell, who's the executive director of the Lawndale Christian Development Corporation, which focuses on affordable housing and community development in this neighborhood. Thank you so much for joining us out here tonight.
Thank you so much for having us.
All right, so you were a child in 1968 on the west side during what had happened. What do you remember? You were really young. You were only 3 years old. So what do you remember about the aftermath of that?
I think most of the stories I heard from my mom and my older brother, who was there at the time and just understood that they were largely just afraid, and there were, ambulances and, police sirens and stuff going on all night. And so, and just hearing stories from other people in the community, like my mentor, Art Turner, and so there was a lot of kind of fear and trepidation about what was going on.
Art Turner, the former state rep, which we interviewed a little earlier in the show, of course. Yes. And, the events of early last week when the looting happened, are there parallels between that and 1968?
Yeah, it's interesting. Unfortunately, not much has really changed. You know, when Dr. King was here in '66, there were issues with going to Cicero, as an example. You know, and you know, the other day we had a young man in our church who was impaled in Cicero. It was white ethnics then, and now it's Latinos. But a guy he basically begged for his life, and he was almost killed. I think redlining has been an ongoing issue. It was an issue when Dr. King was here in '66, and there was a recent story in WBEZ about, I think Alden Lowry and Lunda Lutton talked about, you know, that there's one neighborhood on the north side that has as much investment from banks as all of the neighborhoods on the south and west side combined.
Certainly amazing analysis. And remind us what redlining means and how it's impacted this
Redlining
neighborhood.
essentially means that a bank or insurance company writes a red line around particular neighborhoods and say, we won't lend there and we won't do insurance policies in that neighborhood.
And it was an amazing analysis done by WBEZ. Do you think that lending institutions are going to change their practices given what's happened over the last few weeks?
I think that you only get in Chicago what you're strong enough to get. And so the degree to which they're going to do lots of pronouncements about Black Lives Matters, and we support it. But, you know, the devil's in the details in terms of whether they're actually going to make lending products available to folks that they, for the past, 8 years, have not done.
You know, we talked about looting, and a lot of folks we talked to say, the looting has been happening for 50 years in North Lawndale. Can you explain that?
I think the looting's been happening for 70 years in North Lawndale. When you think about mass incarceration, when you think about the redlining that continues, joblessness, Sears was here, Sears left, health disparities, any number of issues that you can think about. There are problems in our neighborhood, and they continue to be a problem from '66 and '68 onward.
So it's like a mirror. It's the same issues being discussed. And you mentioned Sears. We've got the original Sears Roebuck and Tower there. What are the development projects that you think can happen and you'd like to see happen in North Lawndale?
Sure. So a group of residents and stakeholders have been working for the past 3 years, and we put together a community plan. The organization is called the North Lawndale Community Coordinating Council. We met literally weekly for 3 years and put together a comprehensive plan, the first comprehensive plan in 50 years of North Lawndale. And we also have a homeowners association that we've organized called the North Lawndale Homeowners Association, and Home and Square folks are a part of that homeowners association.
Yeah, it's a beautiful neighborhood in Home and
We're
Square.
working hard to build a plan. We're finalists for the Chicago Prize, the Pritzker Traubert Chicago Prize, and so we have a plan. The issue really is, will we get the resources in this moment when the foundations and everyone's saying, what can we do? Well, we have a plan.
What is that plan? What are the specifics of that?
So there's housing developments that we want to see happen. We're working with another group called United Power for Action and Justice, where we want to build 1,000 homes for working families in North Lawndale, people who the market has kind of forgotten. And so 1,000 on the south side, 1,000 in North Lawndale on the west side. And there are 1,000 city-owned vacant lots just in North Lawndale. So at housing, there's stuff going on. Mount Sinai Hospital has an ambulatory center and a health village that's going to be taking place there. Brenda Palms Barber over at North Lawndale Employment Network, they're taking over the old Community Bank of Lawndale, and they're going to have their offices there and a beautiful cafe and all of the programs that they're doing in terms of employment and working on reducing the number of folks that are unemployed in the neighborhood. And there's going to be art projects that'll take place, and North Lawndale, the Lawndale Christian Legal Center will be doing a campus. So there are lots of projects that are going to be done. And there's other things that I haven't even mentioned that we'd love to see happen. I'd love to see a state-of-the-art, the movie theater converted to a state-of-the-art trade school. I went to Dunbar High School on the south side, and so 4 periods a day, every day, your junior and senior year, you were a plumber, or you were an electrician, or you were whatever.
And you're referring to, there's an empty movie theater in the Lawndale Plaza that has that grocery store as well. And it's been sitting there for a while.
It's been sitting there for a few years, and we'd love to convert it to a vocational school and help 200 people a year be able to work in the trades.
All right, Richard Townsell, a lot on your plate. Thank you so much for joining us.
God bless you. Appreciate it.
All right, Brandis, so we toss it right back to you.
Thanks, Paris. Yeah, we're going to have more on investment and community disinvestment later on in the program. Thank you. And if you're just joining us, this is a WTTW News special, Peace and Justice. We're looking at police relations with the community here in Chicago, as well as systemic racism in society at large. Remember, you can join the conversation on Twitter using the hashtag #PeaceAndJusticeWTTW. And don't forget to join us for a post-show conversation with social impact, community, and thought leaders. You'll find the link to join the Peace and Justice online discussion at WTTW.com/peaceandjustice. Now to our next area of discussion. It's a conversation being held on a regular basis that many argue should not have to be had at all. Angel Ito shares more on how that one conversation might save a life.
Let's just pretend that you're pulled over by an officer. What do you do?
The talk. It's a regular conversation families have with their Black children about how to interact with law enforcement in public.
I would put my phone on the dashboard so they know it's not a weapon. I'd keep my hands on the steering wheel so they can see him at all times. Let them know let them know that I am a minor, and just comply and do what they say.
It's become a conversation that pretty much goes hand in hand with learning how to drive.
Make sure that they see your hands. Did you say anything about your hands being in
Keep
sight?
them on the steering wheel.
Keep them on the steering wheel, or either just put them on the dashboard so that they can see your hands clearly. Because again, at the end of the day, our concern is that you come home safely.
For the parents of high school junior Mpingo Lewis, it's a conversation they frequently have.
It's unfortunate that it's become so widespread now, so every couple of months on the news, we can't escape it. So we started to have the conversation as soon as those things started to present themselves on the TV, on social media. We had to have that conversation before he actually started driving. And once he did start driving, then it was more intense. It was, here are the steps.
I know what to do, and so I would try to respect the police officers, comply to what they're saying, let them know that I'm a minor and that they should contact my parents, and lastly, never run.
For the Fatherhood Mentorship Program, the Dovetail Project on the city's south side, the talk is a regular conversation.
How are you having the talk with the fathers that you mentor?
As a father, I don't believe you can work with young African American fathers who live in urban communities or economically disadvantaged communities and not teach felony street law, which is how to avoid the criminal justice system or how to avoid law enforcement. So if you look at it from that standpoint, it's not normal. You don't see white families having to teach their sons or their daughters how to interact with the police when they pull you over, raise all your windows down, don't move your hand, ask them, can you reach for your wallet? Like, to go through a process like that, right? And to then say, well, he died because he didn't do them things. Like, it's a normal thing.
Devontae Poole, an alum of the organization, says because of the Dovetail Project, he's preparing to have this conversation with his daughters.
My mentality from a distance is, try to make it as digestible as possible, something that she can, fully, grasp at that age. So.
How old are your daughters?
7 and 1. Okay. So I got a lot of time, but.
What age do you think you might have the conversation? You said life will tell you, but is there an idea?
If I was to guesstimate, maybe 11, 12, right around the time where, she's able to understand, like she's able to truly understand in a small fashion.
For blended families like the Raquiles, Rickley, and Bush family, it's the personal experiences they encounter that determine how they'll have that conversation.
The lady puts the ticket in my window and she says, sign this, sir. And so I go to read it and she pulls it out the window and she says, I didn't say read it, I said sign it. What? I don't know what's happening here, but I know I'm not gonna fight you. And so they like, get out the car, and they put handcuffs on me, put me in the back of the squad car, right? Cussed me all the way out to the station, all because I wouldn't read this.
That was the first time that Janoa experienced where his dad was arrested. He called me and just was like, Mom, where's Dad? It's been 3 hours. And then we kind of went into a little bit of a panic mode.
While these interactions are uncomfortable to talk about, Eugene's white brother Peter says it's helped him understand how he must raise his Afro-Latino son.
In the world that we live in, it's so unfortunate and so messed up that you have to have that talk. It just brought me to tears that it just scares me that so much of my family, I'll never understand what they go through each and every day. But if I can kind of understand or try and be on their side and find a way to be a voice to help, that's all I can do.
For Chicago Tonight, I'm Angel Ito.
As we've just seen, parents of black children sometimes struggle with what to say to their kids about navigating not only encounters with the police, but also with a world that often perceives them differently from other children. Joining us to talk about how every family can have thoughtful and productive conversations about race and justice are Angela Searcy, adjunct faculty at Erickson Institute, child development specialist, and author of the book Push Past It, A Positive Approach to Challenging Classroom Behaviors. Reuben Jonathan Miller, associate professor at the University of Chicago School of Social Service Administration and author of the forthcoming book Halfway Home, Race, Punishment, and the Afterlife of Mass Incarceration, and Dwayne Bryant, motivational speaker and author of the book The Stop, Improving Police and Community Relations. All of you, welcome to Chicago Tonight, and thank you for joining us.
Oh, thank you.
Dwayne, let's start with you, please. So as we just saw the talk, black parents, they have it with their children, and it covers how to navigate police interactions. Now, you experienced a traffic stop that inspired a book, and you recreated it for a video, part of which we're going to see right now. But why did you believe that this talk was necessary?
Well, I thought the talk was necessary because when I was speaking to a group of 4th, 5th, and 6th graders on the south side of Chicago, I asked them a simple question. If you're on a playground playing, minding your own business and doing nothing wrong, if a police car drove over, what would you do? And they all said, run. Two of the bigger boys said, I would not run, but if they disrespect me, then I'm going to disrespect them. That's when I knew if these are 4th, 5th, and 6th graders, we have a major problem because they become 9th, 10th, and 11th, and 12th graders, and then men. And so if that's their reaction to law enforcement at such a young age, I knew that we needed to really start having critical conversations with our young people.
And in just a bit, we're going to get to more of what's entailed, what's in that conversation. But Angela, you say that the talk should cover more than just police interactions. What do you mean?
Well, when we talk about that talk that we're having, it should be actually not one singular talk, but actually a series of conversations that talk about, you know, as young children grow, it actually becomes more complex and more sophisticated. And it begins with just describing race and attributes and actually helping children to understand how to respond when there is a conflict or a situation. So it really is a series of talks that grow and develop, and if children have that experience, then they're better able to cope, and it actually supports them in their development and feeling empowered.
And Reuben Jonathan Miller, you study and you write about criminal justice policy. How has that informed your approach in talking to your own children about policing in the black community?
It certainly primed me for it. It's interesting that I followed about 250 people across a couple of cities, and the average age of their first arrest was something like 14. The men and women that I followed have been arrested 25 times on average. There's many stops over the course of a lifetime. And so hearing that and knowing that really helped to inform how I thought about approaching these kinds of conversations with my own children. You know, hey, you'll likely be stopped, or you may be in the car with someone who will be stopped. You know, when these things happen, here are some things to remember, you know, when you get pulled over, you know, try to comply, try to be respectful, these kinds of things. But also it's very important for me to let them know that sometimes you're stopped, in fact, most often you're stopped for nothing that you've done at all. You're stopped for just just hanging around and working very hard to make sure that they don't internalize having been stopped as something that's their problem or something that they've done.
And Reuben, what do you think it says about, you know, the state of being black in America or racism in this country, that black families have to do this, that they still have to do this?
Yeah, you know, I think it aligns with longstanding. Well, there's this long history where black people have really been separated from the presumption of guilt. You know, and maybe to put this differently, you know, black children, particularly, and black people, absolutely have been more or less stripped of our innocence. The research tells us this. We know that police officers view black boys as older, 4 years on average, report them being less innocent, you know, these kinds of things. And so I think it aligns with this longer history. It speaks to a longer history of race and racism in our country.
Dwayne Bryant, when you talk to kids about, interacting with the police, what are the main steps they should be taking or not taking?
There's a few steps, and I always tell them I want them to be mindful of their future. And what I do is I have what right behind me is called the STOP Challenge. There's 9 positioning that both police and community should take, because it's not just the community, because the reality is the community can do 100% of everything that the officer says, and they can still get killed. That is the reality of being Black in America. So what I do is I talk to them about many things, from understanding their rights, from being respectful, but also understanding what their future is, because ultimately you do not want to have a 20-minute encounter to derail 20 years of your life. And I like what Angela said earlier, because in my book, literally it's about, I've had over 17 police encounters. I've never been arrested, never been to jail, but the first one was in elementary school. So what I do is I take the students on a journey of this boy who was their age in elementary school. What happened? Why did we get stopped? What was my responsibility? What was everybody's responsibility around me? What was I thinking? And I realized there was one common thread every time, from boy to high school to middle school to college to adult life, always thinking about the outcome and where I ultimately wanted to go is reach my destiny, and not allow this encounter to stop me from doing that.
Angela Searcy, how can parents, be honest with their children about this topic, and that, this might be a reality for them without also scaring them?
Well, a couple of things to think about. Learning about racism and racial violence is not as scary as experiencing it. So we have to think about learning and teaching them. And just like we have a tornado can be scary, or a fire drill can be scary, well, if you know what to do when there's a fire, you actually feel empowered. So what we want to do is have many conversations, use simple language. Also, not just talking about how Black children may feel, but also including all children within this conversation, that some children feel unsafe, that what we can do about it, how we can support them, and how we can respond when there is a situation that is scary. So really thinking about that this doesn't lead to mental health issues. This actually stops us having mental health issues. And even if we're not talking about it, it's still happening and we're experiencing it. So it's really about that empowerment piece.
And we don't have a whole lot of time left, but it can also be a little bit scary for parents as well, a bit traumatizing for them to have this conversation.
Yes, it can. And really, we have to remember that we want to talk about our feelings. We want to share if we're feeling a little bit anxious or nervous. Children, infants, toddlers, preschoolers, they can all pick up on that. And there's no reason to hide if you feel nervous about this, to share that and then talk about how you're able to cope with it. So the feeling of fear is not bad. It's really about discussing how to get parental input about how to cope with those feelings to be able to support children.
And Ruben Miller, I'm going to leave you the last question. We've got very few seconds. I apologize. But it's not just Black families that need to be talking about this. What do white families need to be talking about with their children?
Well, first of all, the fact of racial injustice in the United States, that Black folks have stopped at disproportionate rates. Having said that, mass incarceration does not stop at the threshold of a Black family. 39% of white boys will be arrested before they turn the age of 23 in this country. So this is a national problem of epic proportions. Black folks are stopped at much greater rate, but white families are not absolved from needing to address this crisis.
Okay. Well put. A lot more to come on this. I'm sure we'll be talking about it for a very long time. My thanks to Angela Searcy, Ruben Jonathan Miller, and Dwayne Bryant.
Hey, thank you.
And for a conversation about possible solutions and how systems and structures can be created that incentivize better behavior, constitutional policing, and how to address the root causes of systemic racism and inequality, we turn to Xavier Ramey, CEO of Justice Informed, a social impact consulting firm, Angelique Power, president of the Field Foundation, Todd Belcour, co-founder and executive director of the national nonprofit Social Change, and Reverend Waltrina Middleton, executive director of the Community Renewal Society. A lot of heavy stuff to get to. Thanks to all of you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
So, Reverend Middleton, let's start with you first, please. As of late, there's been a lot of talk around solutions that are more centered on police reform. But what are some other solutions that are necessary that don't involve police?
Well, I think that being able to build community trust and solidarity is going to be critical and essential. There will be a great need for healing as a result of the protracted trauma that our communities have experienced from witnessing racialized violence that has ultimately resulted in the loss of lives. And so being able to center on places of healing and restorative justice would be quite essential. But ultimately, I think that it's important that the community members have oversight and voice to be heard so that whatever implementation we have going forward involves the hands of the community most critically.
Now, Democrats in D.C. today, they've introduced a bill. It's being dubbed the Justice in Policing Act. First, I'll take you through what some of the key measures are before we get your response. They are use of force only permitted as a last resort, banning chokeholds, banning no-knock warrants in drug cases, requiring body cams for all uniformed officers, requiring all police departments to send use of force data to the federal government, and limiting transfer of military-grade equipment to police. Xavier Ramey, let's start with you. Is this the right approach?
I think it's the right part of an approach. All of these reforms that we've seen come out of Congress today, much like many of the efforts we see, are usually they're what we call reformist reforms. They're not necessarily revolutionary reforms, meaning that they attack the root cause. At the core of the question of police reform is the question around how do we moderate a society such that people are safe, that their property and their well-being is secure, and that their ability to go about pursuing what we sometimes call the American dream is unabated and is not met violently if they try to engage it. Reforming police departments, I think, is absolutely critical. I think that restraining and creating more steps in terms of accountability for use of force guidelines, for accountability whenever there's a discharge of a weapon, I think these are all very, very important. The challenge that I would remind us with that is that they are also reforms that require deeper, further investments in policing as a community development strategy, which is why I say that they are not revolutionary reforms. They are reform-focused reforms. And so what we have heard from many people in community organizations, from Black and Brown communities across the country, and now more and more includingly, white communities, that we need to look at the entire line item. And we need to look at the entire question of how do we engage this topic of safety, and is policing the most important and valuable tradition to create safety for American people.
Well, and obviously, of course, change is not going to happen overnight. But Angelique Power, are there actions that the city, the police department, and especially individuals that they can start taking that would either change things quickly, or what are some initial steps towards long-term change?
Yeah, I'll say that we're in this moment right now, which is so encouraging, where you see some of the biggest protests in our history across the globe happening that center anti-Blackness and center systemic racism. I've never received so many emails in my life from corporate America included that actually is for the first time using the phrase Black Lives Matter. So we're at this fork in the road where we're finally acknowledging historic inequity and that the default operating system in this country is racism. But the question is, what do you do about it? And so equity has become a buzzword. And we've seen also a lot of statements where people are using racial justice and using racial equity with no teeth. And so the next thing that anyone can do from wherever we sit, we all sit in places of power and privilege, whether that is in the boardroom or the conference room, in the private sector, the public sector. Equity is really about realigning power and realigning resources. And so, yes, to Xavier's point, 40% of the budget going to the Chicago Police Department, which means, and on top of that, having additional dollars that pay out for police abuse every year, a budget's a moral document. You're going to get the city that you are budgeting for. And so rather than a surveillance state that relies on abuse, we have an opportunity to defund the police, which means refund communities, and actually move dollars over so that we're investing in the growth of communities, and that happens in boardrooms in the corporate sector, and it happens in philanthropy, it happens in the nonprofit sector.
And I want to come back to sort of that diversion of money, because that's being talked about a lot more in these last couple of weeks as well. But I want to get you in here, Todd Belcourt. Could Mayor Lightfoot have done more in her first year to push through reform?
Well, there's no question that the very person who chaired the Police Accountability Task Force in 2016 is best suited and best situated to provide a full blueprint of recommendations to ensure that there's a better and working relationship between the police and community. And that person is our current mayor, Lori Lightfoot. 2016, she presided over a 190-page report that outlined over 15 reasonable recommendations that could be implemented right now that have been overlooked. And those are many of the things that we've encompassed in the context of our 2020 Black Lives Matter agenda at Social Change, to make sure that something like as important as valuing Black lives is not something that's a talking point, but it's something that's actually legislated and codified. I didn't hear you mention the duty to intervene. As you saw in the George Floyd case, if those police officers had acted responsibly, or at least had some compulsion to get that man's knee off of George Floyd's neck, we wouldn't have this gentleman would still be alive to be with his family today. We also need to talk about the notion of making sure that the police badges and their information is foilable, so we can figure out what's going on and have more transparency in that account as well.
So, sorry, Todd, I wanted to ask you one more thing about that, because on that note, you know, the Fraternal Order of Police has been resistant to reform. How can the city implement changes without having to end up in negotiation with the FOP because it would go into the contract? How can those reforms be implemented without running into that wall?
Well, I think, as has been mentioned, you show me your budget, you are also showing me your priorities. So to the extent that budget changes can be made, that goes outside of the contract, and that creates a different constraint. In times like this, which are clearly times that have been declared emergencies as curfews, you're allowed to then go outside the structure of a contract to do what's necessary for the quality of life of the city. So I certainly encourage Mayor Lightfoot to advocate for the same policy she was advocating for in 2016, but also, as already been said, to make sure justice reinvestment and prioritizing quality of life and public safety is done in a way that's more holistic and isn't only prioritizing the consideration of law enforcement and the police presence in our communities versus things that actually uplift communities and empower people to be in a better position to uplift themselves.
Reverend Middleton, we were just talking about a little while ago, there's been discussion about defunding the police department and what that looks like. Some people hear defunding and they hear abolish. How would that work? How would defunding the police department work?
Well, I think that Angelique made a great point that defunding simply means it creates opportunities for our communities. When you hear of a multi-million-dollar budget for the Fraternal Order of Police, and yet teachers had to take to the streets in order to get the resources that they need inside of our educational system for our children, our youth, then that's a critical problem. And so I think with the GAPA ordinance, the Grassroots Accountability Alliance for Police Accountability, it presents an opportunity for community oversight. You asked the question about how do we move forward without necessarily bringing the police in, but because it is a systemic and systematic issue, we have to address the structure of the police that has created racialized violence and death. And so we need to be able to look at ordinance opportunities like GAPA that can provide direct contact, feedback, and oversight by citizens. And as Todd mentioned, if we have a mayor who served as president of this task force, then this mayor, above all else, should be able to critically understand the importance of having citizens at the table. And we are pushing her to pass GAPA now and to return to the table with the citizens of Chicago. We haven't spoken to her since March, and it's been on her table. We're ready to pass GAPA. We're ready to meet with the mayor and be able to bring about this systemic change to prevent Laquan McDonald's, Breonna Taylor's, and the like from happening again.
Xavier Ramey, give us, if you would, sort of the historical context in terms of the lack of investment in Black communities.
Well, first we have to look at not just investment, but divestment. There's a history of divestment, meaning the removal of resources and investments from Black communities. We can look at everything from the wholesale destruction of property and things like the Tulsa race riots, all the way down to here in Chicago, Ta-Nehisi Coates' seminal piece, The Case for Reparations, and the generations-long divestment, meaning the stripping of resources, the taking away of financial funding, the removal of agency through mortgage contracts, totaling nearly $3 billion in today's dollars just from the North Lawndale community alone through mortgages. And so when you look at that, I think we have to start with the question, not where are we not investing as much? We need to follow that breadcrumb to understand where we've been, where we as a society, where we as a government have been taking resources from Black communities and redistributing them in places that would say that those investments need not be returned or were never even taken in the first place. As it relates to policing, we have to realize that municipal budgets, unless you're going to grow the budget, we're talking about a redistribution. And so as it relates to police, we would have to look at the 40% of the Chicago's corporate budget that we're currently spending on police in line with the investments that we are thus not spending in Chicago communities that require a social service response to social service issues. Right now, we only have a budget and a government that allows primarily for a policing response to social service issues. You cannot combat poverty with police. You cannot combat homelessness with police. You cannot combat domestic abuse with police. And yet, that is our only solution.
Yeah, and we certainly can't do it alone. Sorry to cut you off. I'm probably going to give Angelique Power the last word on this here because we're about out of time. You know, it's been said that racism is not a Black problem. It is a white problem. What do you think white people need to be doing, saying, thinking about as we keep this going?
Well, I think that this is an awakening moment and that people, you know, of color have actually been talking about a lot of this and training up on this for a long time. So I would first recommend centering Black voices and Black thought, centering community organizations that have been doing this work, as opposed to coming up with new ideas. But I would also recommend getting trained. And there are so many places to understand what white supremacy means, to understand what, you know, white fragility looks like. And so I wouldn't just post a Black square on your Instagram, send out a Black Lives Matter hashtag, and leave it at that. I would actually study up on what it means to be an ally, because we need you. We need everyone to get to where we're all envisioning that we have to be.
Well said, and I'm sure there is more to come. This discussion, it goes on and on and on. My thanks to Xavier Ramey, Angelique Power, Todd Belcour, and Reverend Waltrina Middleton. Thanks to all of you.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it, Brandon.
Thank you.
And that's our show for this evening. Stay with WTTW News and Chicago Tonight for much more on these issues in the coming days and weeks. And right now, you can head to WTTW.com/peaceandjustice for a post-show conversation with social impact and community and thought leaders. Again, that's at WTTW.com/peaceandjustice. Now, for all of us at WTTW News, thank you for watching. Have a good night.
I thought these were much bigger. So what's the mileage on this thing?
Freedom, freedom, I can't lose. Freedom, don't be loose. Yeah. Come on, Bronzeville, come on out the house. Bronzeville, come on out the house.
Closed captioning is made possible by Robert A. Clifford and Clifford Law Offices, a Chicago personal injury and wrongful death firm whose pro bono work kept open a church shelter for the homeless in Chicago's southern suburbs.
In Chicago!